Greetings and welcome. My name is Curt Thompson, and I've been invited to share with you today some reflections about what we Christians call the fall. You've already heard about the creation, and when it comes to the fall, I will get to that in just a moment. But first, I thought I would share with you a little bit about myself as we get started so that you'll know a little bit about who you're dealing with. I live in Northern Virginia. I've been married for 35 years and have two children who are 31 and 28. I was born and reared in Ohio, and so naturally a Buckeye fan. I'm the youngest of four sons. My brothers were 18, 16, and 11 when I was born, and my parents were in their 40s. And so there's a whole story that I could tell there, but I'll save you the trouble. And I would also say that I love Jesus, but quite imperfectly, and that I am a professional sinner. I'm not an amateur sinner, I'm professional. I figure if you've been doing something for a really long time and you're really good at it, you can call yourself a pro. I'm simply glad that there are only 10 commandments, that there are out there to break and not more than that. Gives me some relief at the end of every day. My day job, what I earn a living at, is that as a psychiatrist, which means I'm a physician. I went to medical school and residency, and now I see patients on a regular basis, and I treat the problems that the patients bring to me. Problems like depression, anxiety, panic disorder, substance abuse, manic depression, eating disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, and on occasion, those fans who cheer for Michigan. Given the nature of my work, there's little doubt for me that there are problems in the world that are not getting any better. I don't really have much to argue against the notion that there's something deeply wrong with who we are. That there was or has been a fall of some kind would make complete sense given my day-to-day work life. Therefore, it's not very hard for me to believe in a fall, even if I wasn't a follower of Jesus. I might not call it sin, but I would know that something, many things, are not the way they're supposed to be. But my real work, as I address any and all of these issues with the people that I work with, is ultimately that of helping people tell their stories more truly. Many, if not most, of our symptoms that walk into my office are due to how we tell our stories in 100 different ways that are simply not true to the way the world really is. I have a patient who one time came to see me, and when I asked him, tell me about what it was like growing up in your house, he said, I grew up in a loving Christian home, which many of you who are listening to this might echo that. And then I asked him, well, tell me a little bit about who was in charge of discipline in your house. As he went on to talk about his life in the home, he described how one of his parents would often find themselves in a rather brutal relational, abusive relationship with one of his siblings. I then asked him, what then did you mean when you said you grew up in a loving Christian home? That's an example, for instance, of someone who has to tell a story that enables him to get through his day, even though the story is not really true to what's happening for him. This is what we do all the time. We are always telling stories about ourselves and about the world in our minds and in our heads and in our hearts that aren't necessarily true to the way the world really is. This means then that the first question that we have to entertain and determine is, in which story do you believe you are living? That's a question that we'll return to over and over here right now as well as later on in this conversation. If there is or was such a thing as a fall, how would we even know that? We would necessarily have to perceive that with our minds in the same way that we're perceiving all the symptoms that walk into my office. In my work, one of the things we talk about is what the human mind actually is, how it develops and perceives things, and what it looks like when the human mind is actually flourishing and when it's not. Here's the short version of that. The mind is an embodied and relational process. Now, we could say a lot more about that, but one thing that we would want to know is that my mind isn't just the thing that I think with. It's not just my thoughts. I think things for sure, but I also sense and image and feel things, and I also do things with my body. My mind isn't just about my brain. My mind is about my entire body, but it's also a relational process. When a newborn comes into the world, when you were born, with all of your 100 billion neurons in your brain, those neurons were about 15 to 20% ready to go to live in the world. The other 80 to 85% of those neurons in your brain required the interaction with another human brain, another human relationship, in order for them to actually live and flourish in the world. We are embodied and we are relational. Your mind is always being affected by those around you, even in their embodied presence. Think of it just a moment. You might be gathered with somebody in your context in which you're listening to this. Imagine if you were just listening to it on your own. Your entire experience of that would be different. Not only is the mind embodied and relational, but it also develops, as we like to say, from bottom to top and right to left. What does this mean? But that our brain tends to develop from our brainstem, which is at the very bottom of our brain, and functions kind of like reptile brains do, fight or flight. And then it ascends to our limbic circuitry that emerges our emotional states, and then it ascends further into our cortex, or the top part of our brain, that sets us apart as being human beings. It develops bottom to top, but also right to left. The right side of my brain, which tends to do particular things, tends to develop a little earlier than the left side of my brain does. First, I sense things. On the right side of my brain, I sense and image and feel things. Then on the left side of my brain, I tend to make sense of what I sense. My right brain sends things to my left, and my left helps me with language and literal and logical thinking to process what it is that I'm thinking and make sense of the world that I'm living in. But that whole process of bottom to top and right to left only ever takes place in the context of relationships, in the context of a community. And we've all grown up in a particular one. Perhaps our family, our church setting, our school settings, our neighborhoods. We all have particular communities of people within which our minds are being formed. And eventually, in that community, we become something that no other animal on the planet becomes. We become storytellers. Now, it's possible that elk and squirrels are telling stories, but they're not telling us about the stories that they're telling. As far as we know, we humans are the only ones that tell stories the way that we do. But remember, that story that we are telling is formed and told in the context of a community. And so we never tell stories without somebody else being in the room or being in your mind. Someone else is always involved. And that someone, whether it's your parents or your grandparents, or your teacher or your coach or your siblings or your friends or your enemies, will draw your life into a place where the story you are telling eventually is fraught with some kind of pain. Eventually, our story has elements in it that we look around and we say, there's something not quite right here. Something not quite right with what's happening in my family. Something not quite right with what's happening with my friendship, with my boyfriend, my girlfriend, my development of my sexuality, all the things. There's something not quite right about me and us. And then we look to the larger landscape and we say that there's also something not quite right about the bigger story. There's something not quite right about our political fractions, about our racism. Something not quite right about what we do to the creation. There's something not right. It's no secret then that we humans long for a world of goodness and beauty. And as you've already heard in the creation story, that beauty and goodness were everywhere to be found in the beginning. They are our destiny. In Genesis chapter 1, for instance, we read that God saw that it was good. Saw, in fact, that it was beautiful. We notice that day 1, day 2, day 4, 5, 6, all of those days, that at the end of the day, God looked and saw that it was good, what he had made. And the word good in the English language can be translated in the Hebrew equally for the word beautiful. And so we see that God saw that it was not just good, but that it was beautiful. Moreover, that the beauty that he saw was something that came forth as a function of him looking at it. So much beauty, so much goodness. But we look around, and I can easily say that it doesn't take a neuroscientist like myself to see that although there is still beauty and goodness galore, much, if not most, of what we experience still feels like it's ugly and violent. From the smallest glance or thought of contempt, to the sexual abuse in our homes or churches, to the social structures of racism and our commitment to the warmongering of our empire, and for all of our longing for beauty, our desire of it rather becomes our devouring of it. We devour the beauty of our world and we devour each other. How is this so? One could easily pose the question, what is wrong with us after all? We look around and see so much havoc. It's not hard to ask the question, what is wrong with us? But I want to suggest that an even more helpful question might be, what happened to us? Not just what is wrong with us, but what happened to us? And what happened is what we Christians call the fall of humankind. This notion of the fall, this notion that we are marred, that we're flawed, that we're imperfect, that we are sinful, that we are broken, and we are broken in such a way that we need help from the outside, this is not fashionable in our world, a world that is deluded by the notion of progress, evolutionary or otherwise. We'd like to believe, and we are told every day, all day, in so many different ways, that we are getting better and better, despite what greets us every day outside our doorstep. And we who are getting better and better, everyone who thinks like we think in our tribe, we are the ones who are actually on the path to that destiny. Everyone who doesn't think like us are the ones who are not getting better and better. In fact, some stake their entire academic and public careers on this notion, writing and selling books that proclaim this story, that we are getting better and better, and we're doing so by our own hand. Despite the fact that we have a thing called global warming, despite the fact that we have wars on every doorstep, whether that doorstep is from country to country or in our own kitchens. That notion that we are getting better and better is a particular story, but it's not one that the Bible tells. The Bible does tell us in Genesis chapter 1 that God began with goodness and beauty, as we've already noted, which is important because we often think that the message that we get about following Jesus is primarily one in which we lead with this notion that we are broken and sinful. But the leading edge of the gospel begins at the beginning. The leading edge of the gospel begins with God who is a creator, God who's in the business of making beauty and goodness everywhere he looks, everywhere he walks. But part of that beauty and goodness is that we've been made in his image, and as people who are made in his image, we are often in the business of making choices. Furthermore, in Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, we see that when God did make us, when God created Adam, he did so in an intimate way and not from a distance. And the Lord God formed the man from the dust of the earth, this mud that God gets down in the middle of, and from the dust of the earth, he breathes life into man's nostrils, the breath of life. He's an intimately making God. And then we get to verses 21 and 23 of chapter 2. And we read that when God created woman, he did it in an intimate manner, but inflicted a wound in the process. For he caused the man to fall into a deep sleep. And in taking one of the man's ribs, he fashioned the woman and closed up the place with flesh. Now, this is interesting. Who knew that to make a woman, you were going to have to conduct a surgical operation? Now, I mean, like, if I'm Adam, I'm thinking, like, there was no signed consent form. You didn't ask me if I wanted this surgical procedure. I just fell asleep. You figure, there's plenty of mud to go around. You already made me. Why couldn't you just make her out of mud? What with the wound? Strikingly, God brought the woman to the man afterwards, but who knows how long God and the woman were together before he brought her to the man, with her spending intimate time with him, this God of intimacy. And when we read further, out of this surgical procedure, instead of agony came poetry and song, as Adam declares his astounding amazement at what God has brought forth. All of this creating of beauty and goodness is very intimate, which is important for us to know when it comes to our brokenness. Because as it turns out, evil very much intends to take advantage of intimacy and our longing for it and our desire for beauty and goodness on the way to devouring us. We see at the conclusion of Genesis 2 that we find the man and his wife naked and unashamed. This is significant. Why did the writers go to the trouble of letting us know that the man and his wife were naked and unashamed? We might easily say that he's preparing us for, setting us up for what's coming in the next chapter, but I also want us to be aware of this, that great creativity requires at least three things, and those three things are mentioned here in this verse. That great creativity requires differentiation. We have male and we have female. For me to create, I need something different than myself. I need something other than me. I don't just need female. If I'm a white guy, I need a female who's African American. I need my Hispanic friends. I need my Asian American friends. These are people, they're different from me. I need something different if we are going to create a world of beauty and goodness. We're differentiated. But we are also naked. And by this, the Hebrews were not just referring to their physical state. They're referring to the fact that these creatures are vulnerable. Human beings are the only animals on the planet that necessarily have to wear clothing in order for us to survive. Now, in so doing, we survive in all kinds of places. We survive where it's very cold. We survive where it's very hot. We do all kinds of things to protect our vulnerability. But we are the only ones who have to wear clothing, which is important then, because we recognize that we don't choose if we are vulnerable. We already are. The question is, to what degree will we reveal that? And we see here also that creativity requires the presence of vulnerability. Now, look, we're the only people who need clothes. I know that there are other people who put clothes on their animals. People put clothes on their dogs. Like, this is weird. That's kind of like a psychiatric designation of that. Now, maybe you're somebody, you're some of those folks who put, clothes on your dog. It's okay. It's still weird, but it's okay. But we need to be clothed. I need the protection of you. I need you to protect me, and I need your help to help me be the person that I need to be. I'm vulnerable in both of those ways. And even more critically, we read that the man and his wife, differentiated, were naked, were vulnerable, and they were unashamed. Now, the Hebrews had all kinds of words that they could have used to describe the states of mind of the first couple. They could have been naked and happy. They could have been naked and unafraid, naked and confident, naked and pleased. A whole range of things that we could have described, words that we could have used to describe that. But in this situation, the Hebrews know, the ones who are telling the story know that shame is a crucial element because, first of all, it begins so early in our human development. But second of all, it is at the very doorstep of their standing on a threshold of great generativity. There they stood, waiting for the opportunity to move into the world, to be what they were destined to be. And then begins Genesis chapter 3 and our collective descent into hell. We could talk forever and a day about this part of the story. Suffice to know this, that this story, all of it in fact, Genesis 1, Genesis 2, and Genesis 3, this story is our story as individuals and as a people. We would like to think that it isn't. I know I often live as if it isn't. I don't want to believe that I'm that guy that was asleep at the wheel when Eve was having a conversation with a serpent who was trying to devour her. I don't want to believe that I'm throwing people under the bus. I don't want to believe that I'm a person who condemns others. I don't want to believe that I'm that woman or that man. But I am. This descent begins with a conversation. Notice, it doesn't begin with something that happens from a distance. The devil, the serpent, doesn't send the woman a letter. He doesn't send her a text. He doesn't send her an email. He's going to have an intimate conversation with her. And he's going to counter God's intimate encounter with the woman and the man. He's going to counter that intimacy. It's important to know that our deepest, darkest, most broken, most shameful places happen in a context of intimate relationships, and then it recedes into the intimacy and recesses of our own minds where it stays and collects and abscesses. Also remember this: evil does its best work in the middle of good work being done. Apart from goodness and beauty in the world, evil has no existence. It is a parasite. And it wants to parasitically latch on to this first couple in order to devour it. And so it begins with a conversation in which he asks the woman, did God really say, you must not eat from any tree in the garden? One can already see the wheels turning. He's already misrepresenting God. I want to tell us that I have a practice of misrepresenting people in my mind, most of all God. I misrepresent God all the time. There's a part of me that thinks that God's actually a tyrant, that at the end of the day, I'm not going to get what I really want from God. I'm not going to get the right job. I'm not going to get the right girlfriend, boyfriend. I'm not going to get the right spouse. I'm not going to get the right future. I'm not going to get from God what I want, because God is a tyrant. Already, evil is shaping God out to be somebody other than who he is. And the first thing that you recognize in this conversation, not just the content, but the fact that the devil starts in isolation. The devil, he's not waiting for God to come along for his daily walk in the late afternoon or evening. He's going to have this conversation outside of God's earshot. This harkens back to what we read earlier in the second chapter of Genesis, but that I didn't cite, this notion that when God made the woman, he proclaimed that it's not good for the man to be alone. It's not good for any of us to be alone, and evil is going to take advantage of this. He's going to have this conversation as much in isolation as possible. He doesn't say to the woman, hey, let's gather you and your husband together, and then let's wait till God comes along, and then we'll have a conversation of the four of us. He's taking advantage of this isolation. This is what happens to us all the time. This activates already relational distress. He's pitting God and the woman against each other from the very outset. Her answer, as we all recognize, reveals her distorted memory when she says, no, it's not true that we can't eat. In fact, we can eat from any tree except for one that we can't even touch. There's an interesting thing about memory and the mind and the brain and the way it works. Our memory is not just a function of the facts. We often think, well, what does it mean to remember things? I remember like where I put my keys. I remember that 3 times 2 is 6. I remember that you said this to me last Friday night and that really hurt my feelings. But one thing that we often are unaware of is that the way we remember is shaped by the very context in which we are trying to remember. If you were imagining a really lovely experience that you had yesterday, and you were imagining it today, sitting here listening to the Jubilee conference, that's one thing. If you're listening to this, if you're remembering that event, but you're on an airplane bound for the front between Russia and Ukraine, that's a different kind of remembering. And evil is taking advantage of the context in which he wants to shape the way she remembers things as a way to distort what's taking place. And in this sense, evil is not just messing with the facts, it's traumatizing a relationship. Evil is using facts, wielding facts as a way to emotionally shape how this woman's relationship with God is being shifted. In this way, the serpent is wounding her, but it's a different kind of wound than the wound that Adam received. This wound is taking place in isolation for the purpose of disintegration and devouring, as opposed to the wound that Adam received, that God brought about in the process of bringing Eve into existence, the process of creating beauty and goodness. And with this wound that evil gives to the woman, I want to suggest that it begins to wield shame in this very conversation long before any fruit gets eaten. I have a patient who, when she was 19, received a phone call from her father who said that he was leaving her mother and her siblings and moving from the East Coast to Seattle, where he had another family, where he had fathered 2 other children with a woman that nobody on the East Coast even knew about. Now, this would have been 4 decades ago, long before we had internet, long before we had Facebook, long before we had cell phones. There would have been no way for her family to know. But what he told her next was even harder to hear. He said, "But I don't want you to worry. It's not your fault that I'm leaving." Now, what's important to know here is that my patient, who at the time when she was 19, already was well aware that if you can make a choice to go to Seattle, then you can make a choice to stay here. And what's not enough about me to keep you? Why am I not enough? I don't care that you're saying it's not my fault, but why am I not enough to keep you from going? And I want to invite you to consider that something like that may have been going on here. Imagine that if you're the woman and you're hearing this serpent tell you things about God, it's not true, because he knows that in the day that you eat thereof, you will become like him. He's telling her something about God, but leaving her to draw conclusions about herself. This is a story in which the serpent is talking about God, but inferring things about her. If God won't let you be like him, maybe perhaps you're not worth his letting you be like him. But evil is the second smartest force on the planet. And it will do everything it can to do as little as it can to let you draw the conclusions about yourself that it won't have to. And so the descent begins. One can imagine that if you're hearing all this, you're hearing things about God, but starting to feel things about yourself, that same distress that overcame my patient who was 19 could easily start to show up in anyone who was facing the serpent for the first time. One can imagine that she starts to feel things that are uncomfortable, and so naturally, of course, the tree on the fruit starts to look very, very enticing. I've come to believe the lie the serpent has told, but more than I just believe it with my thinking brain, I sense it in my body. As we said, the mind is an embodied relational process. I'm not just believing. To believe is to be living. It is to live as if I'm not lovable. And I feel that lack of lovableness in my chest, in my face, in my hands. I embody it. I take on the sense that there's something wrong with me long before I have words to say it. And at this point, the fruit becomes a coping strategy that enables me to be nourished, to be wise, and to have power over and against this awful thing that is consuming me in my very self. She's chosen to imagine that her relationship with God is less than, that she is less than what the true story about her really is. She begins to believe that she lives in a story of scarcity. And who wouldn't want to have someone join you in that? She draws her husband in, offering him fruit, who's willing to collude with her. And as such, shame tightens the noose. We read in Genesis chapter 3, verse 7, their eyes were opened. Notice that this is not an active tense of the verb. It does not read, and they opened their eyes. Their eyes were opened, and one has to wonder who or what opened them. It is important to know that once shame is embedded in us, it grows until we then share it with others. We shame others out of our own shame. One can imagine Adam and Eve with their fruit looking at each other and him saying to her and her saying to him, "Oh, I've never noticed that part of you before that I now don't really like." And their covering was not just from God, their covering was from each other with whom they had been naked and unashamed for who knows how long. This shame leads to our hiding and then to our own condemnation. We turn our gaze away from God and from others. We find ourselves then somehow in the privacy of our own minds, alone with our shame. We're alone and must fare for ourselves. We no longer are able to collaborate with God in the storytelling venture. It's difficult for me to hear God's voice saying, "You are my daughter. You are my son whom I love and in him I'm well pleased." I can't believe I get to be your God. I can't hear that. We're all well aware that we're not very good at loving each other. Like, I'm the chief among sinners, as I said earlier. Like, I'm a professional sinner. I'm really good at not loving people that are hard for me to love. But that's not my biggest problem. My biggest problem is that I have a difficult time receiving love because I can't give what I don't have. Part of why I can't give love to the people that I have a hard time loving is because I haven't yet received it. I have a hard time receiving it because I'm too terrified that that's going to require an intimate connection with someone who, when they get close to the part of me that I hate the most, they're going to go. And that's the way that I tell the story now. And I tell my story as a way to enable me to cope with my emotional state of shame, in the same way that the woman told the story that if I take the fruit, it'll make me wise, it'll make me nourished, it'll make me powerful. It's no longer a true story. And not just because of the facts, because it's not true to who we were made to be. We begin to tell our story differently, including that God is at best disinterested in us, and at worst he is, as I said earlier, a tyrant. He's not good and he's not kind. In the end, he will treat us like fools. And we are reminded that the devil was the craftiest of all the creatures that the Lord God had placed in the garden. To be crafty is to intend to fool others. His intention was to fool the woman and the man, and in the end, they end up believing that God is the one who wants to fool them. We are left with our sense of condemnation, which in turn we foist upon God and everybody else. Sin, then, this fall, is our proclivity to practice living like this, and shame is the emotional or affective state that accompanies it. It shatters our ability to create, and it shatters our capacity to know what has happened to us in the first place. So I go about trying to rid myself of my shame with all of my choices that widen my separation from God and from each other. All those choices get wrapped up in my addictions, in my contempt for myself and others, my sexual immorality, my consumption, my devotion to violence, my racism, my arrogance. And I shrivel my capacity not only to create beauty, but even to imagine it. Most of the people who come to see me in my office are like many who are watching this right now. To be depressed, or to be anxious, or to have substance or pornography addiction is not so much to be sinful. I would never say to someone that your depression is sin. Somehow it's about you're not having prayed enough. Somehow you haven't confessed enough. It's a function of many, many different things that we wouldn't primarily talk about first and foremost as sin. But the question is not primarily about our symptoms. Though they are important, the bigger question is the story that we tell about them. We want to be rid of our symptoms, but we are afraid to live into a different story. I have many people who come to my office who want to be not sick, but that's a far different thing than wanting to be well. The fall tells us the story of what happened to us and what continues to happen to us and what we continue to do to ourselves and to each other and to the world that leaves us repetitively in this place of self-reinforcing shame, brokenness, and separation from God and from each other. And that, my friends, doesn't require a neuroscientist to tell you. And there is no question that to live into a different story, the story that Jesus is and wants us to join him in telling, will require that we turn away from the story we are currently believing that we're living in. I tell people that the news about the fall and the sin and its associated shame is far worse than we know and far better than we can imagine. For with the fall and in our shame, we need someone to come and find us. Fortunately for us, that is exactly what God in Jesus has come to do. And I, for one, can't wait for you to hear how that story is going to end. Let's pray together. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Holy Trinity, we give you thanks and praise for the way you continue to meet us and tell us the true story of who we are, and that even in our sin, even in our brokenness, even in our shame that seems so inescapable from us, from anything we can do, and truly is inescapable, even in the face of that, you in Jesus are coming for us. And today, as we've been reminded already of the beauty and goodness of your first creation, and now are being reminded of the truth about the state of affairs that we're really living in, we look for you to come to find us, to transform us, to regenerate us, to recommission us, that we may once again become storytellers of a new story, one that leaves us in a place and leads us into a place wherein which we can once again create with you the beauty and goodness that you have prepared for us before the foundation of the world. And we say all this in the name of Jesus the Christ. Amen.